All right, in the first PowerPoint, we talk about some of the adaptations that plants have gone through. So to kind of recap those, out of the different adaptations that plants went through, the development of the cell wall, the cuticle, the way that it reproduces was probably the biggest one. Now remember that scientists believe that plants, the first plant over 1 billion years ago was that green algae that made its way from being an aquatic plant to becoming eventually a land plant. And it had to go through those adaptations in order to do so. Now, when a plant goes through these adaptations, it's meeting these needs in the water, and it just can't stop meeting those needs once it goes onto land. So it has to go through the adaptations and still find a way to meet those needs while being a land plant now as well. We need to remember what are those basic necessities of plants. And they are, plants need sunlight. Plants have to have sunlight in order to establish photosynthesis or carry out photosynthesis. Plants need to have that ability to exchange that carbon dioxide inside of them and produce oxygen as a waste product and release it. So it's that gas exchange of carbon dioxide for oxygen. They need water, obviously, and they need minerals. Now, in elementary, you're taught, oh, plants need sunlight, water, and soil. But remember that not all plants need soil. And the plants that do need soil. Obviously, soil allows their roots to take place, to take hold of the land and to stand up firm. But that's not the only reason. The big reason is because soil contains minerals. The minerals that they need to be able to turn that cellulose and chitin and so forth into the sugar that they need to produce that adenosine triphosphate that they're going to use as energy. So plants need sunlight, they need the exchange of gas, they need water, and they need minerals. Remember that aquatic plants also is a perfect example of how plants don't use soil. They just need minerals. All right, plants are going to be classified under that kingdom referred to as plantae. Plants are eukaryotic. It's very important to remember that all plants are eukaryotic. Most plants are eukaryotic, meaning that all of plant cells have a nucleus. Okay, that's what makes them eukaryotic. Plants are multicellular. They are all basically eukaryotic. They contain those cell walls that have that cellulose, that sugar that they produce and use. It allows them to carry out photosynthesis using the two types of common chlorophyll, chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B. We get much more in depth into chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B when we do photosynthesis and cell respiration. So again, plants have that basic need. Sunlight, the way to exchange gas with the surrounding air. They need water and they need their minerals. So sunlight, plants typically have those leaves for sunlight. Leaves are designed the way they are purposefully because it gives them what? It gives them a larger, or it's the structure of the plant that gives them a larger surface area. Now, why is that kind of important? Because again, the more surface area you have for the leaf, and you got to think of the leaf as kind of like the solar panel for the plant. Well, if the objective of the plant is to take in sunlight, then the bigger the leaf, the more sunlight it can absorb in that chlorophyll. Or in the chloroplast, the structure itself in the leaf that goes through photosynthesis. The greater the surface area, the more photosynthesis the plant can go through. So sunlight is important on those leaves, and the leaves are typically designed in a way to provide the plant with enough surface area so that it can go through as much photosynthesis as needed for that plant to grow. Plants are also going to have those specialized tissues to carry water and nutrients up and down throughout the tree. Those specialized tissues are known as what? First one begins with an X, the other word begins with a PH. Xylem and phloem. Those specialized tissues are xylem and phloem. Xylem, to kind of recap, xylem pulls what? Water from where to where? From the roots to the rest of the plant. Xylem tissue only pushes water what? Upward. It only goes in one direction. Phloem pulls what? Or moves what? Moves not water, but typically sugar from where to where? From the leaves to the rest of the plant. Therefore, since it's going from the leaves to the rest of the plant, then that phloem tissue is going to push up and down in both directions. Those are the specialized tissues that are going to carry water and nutrients upward from the soil and distribute them throughout the rest of the plant, and from the leaves up and down throughout the rest of the plant. All right, botanists basically divided plants long ago into 5 major groups, or the kingdom of Plantae into 5 major groups. And they are one is the embryo formation, the way that plants started forming embryos. There we go into the gametophyte and sporophyte, which we'll talk about now in a minute. The specialized water conducting tissue. Here we're talking about what? The differences between the 2 major types of plant, which are vascular and non-vascular. Remember that non-vascular were those plants that we referred to as not really having a true root system. And your vascular plants are the ones that do have xylem and phloem, which are going to move water and sugar throughout the rest of the body of the plant. You have your seeded plants. Excuse me. You have your seeded plants, and you have your flowering plants. We'll get into angiosperms and gymnosperms at that point. So, to kind of go backwards in recapping the evolution of plants, I gave you this picture here so you can see the ancestor. What is this? This is that green algae that we believe was that first plant to make it from water to land. And eventually at some point, this plant ancestor of green algae developed the secondary type of plant that basically started to form embryos. And so here is where the gametophyte and sporophyte start to develop. The change, that alternation of generation starts to develop here. From there, plants again take another diversification into becoming some of them vascular and some of them non-vascular. The development of that xylem and phloem tissue occurs here. Our fern is a prime example of that. From there, we start to develop the seeded plant. The gymnosperm came before the angiosperm. So we have that gymnosperm first, and then after that we have the angiosperm, which are the flowers, or rather the trees and plants that produce flowers. And it's important to also point out that in angiosperms, they produce flowers which are going to contain the seed. Okay? It's not that this one produces seeds and this one produces flowers. The gymnosperm produce seeds, and that's the reproductive organ. The angiosperm produce flowers, and in that flower will be the seed, and the seed is going to be typically enclosed or encased in some kind of a fruit. Okay? And this is basically the cladogram, if you will, of how plants developed, basically separating these four groups. So now let's talk about the gametophyte and sporophyte phase of the plant. Remember that the gametophyte and sporophyte phase of the plant cycling around is what's referred to as the alternating phases of the life cycle of a plant. The plant is going to have both the diploid phase. It shows you 2N because it has two sets, or both sets of gametes, okay? And it's going to have the haploid phase. Here's where we're basically only talking about the spores. All right, this picture is really important. So I want to make sure that you kind of get used to seeing this illustration here. It basically depicts, it's in the book, by the way. Excuse me. It's in the book. So when you read through chapters 22 and 23 in the text, it gives you this illustration. It's very common. You might see it on the EOC as well. Anyway, this is the picture, the illustration that shows what we call the alternation of generations, how those gametophytes produce and eventually produce a sporophyte and back to the gametophyte over and over and over again. Okay, so the color gives you an indication here. The sporophyte is what we refer to as that diploid phase. The sporophyte is, remember, the tiny little, is going to produce those tiny little spores. Okay? So when you see the spores, that would be referred to as the sporophyte phase of that plant. A particular plant is going to go through a sporophyte phase. In the sporophyte phase, it's going to have both the fertilized sperm and egg that eventually are going to produce the spores. The spores are going to go through meiosis, so they're basically going to copy over and over and over and over, right? And when they do, those tiny little spores, after copying, are going to produce the gametophyte. The gametophyte is the plant that contains the gametes of, depending on where we're talking about, whether we're talking about a angiosperm or gymnosperm, it could contain either the sperm or the egg, or it could contain both sperm and egg if it's an angiosperm, if it's a flowering plant. Now, let's say, for example, that's the case. It's going to contain, the gametophyte is going to contain both gametes of sperm and egg. Again, under the right conditions, if it becomes moist enough and so forth and all that, with a little bit of luck, the sperm on one side of the flower finds its way to the egg on the other side of the flower, and voila, fertilization will then occur. Once fertilization of both gametes occurs, you end up with what? You end up with a sporophyte. And then that sporophyte phase of the plant will again continue to live and eventually produce tiny little spores. Those spores will reproduce and copy through the process of meiosis and produce tiny little gametophytes. And those gametophyte will again have sperm and egg, reproduce it in the flower, and then the cycle just continues over and over and over. So what's important to know is that when a plant is in the sporophyte phase, it has both sets of gametes in that cell. It's going to then produce spores, which only going to contain one set, or it could contain it as one set of gametes, both sets of gametes rather, but separately in that flower. Okay? Through the process of pollination, this also speeds up the process, if you will, in this as well. But this alternation of generation, where the plant, a gametophyte, after fertilization, produces a sporophyte, and a sporophyte, after meiosis, produces a gametophyte. Those phases continue to cycle over and over and over again. So, the multicellular diploid phase of a plant is known as the sporophyte. It's a plant that's going to produce spores. The fern, for example, is a very common example of this. So, in this sporophyte phase, eventually the plant is going to produce spores. Spores is just one set of the gamete. But what it's going to do is those spores are going to start to copy and copy and copy through the process of meiosis. Eventually, those copies are going to be the multicellular haploid phase of the plant, the gametophyte, because they're going to contain the gamete producing part of the plant, the flower, that is going to contain the sperm and or the egg. So when we see the plant during that phase of it, it's the gametophyte phase of the plant. The plant then goes through fertilization under the right conditions, is going to go through fertilization, and then the copy that comes out is going to have both sets of chromosome in the cell, and so therefore it's going to be what? It's going to be the sporophyte, the diploid phase in a plant. Okay, the sporophyte produces the haploid spores. Remember, just like cell reproduction in us, you get the diploid cell that produces the 4 haploid cells, those germ cells in us that do that. Same thing in a plant. The sporophyte produces the haploid spores through meiosis, and those spores are going to eventually grow into those multicellular structures called the gametophytes. And then in the gametophytes, it's going to contain the sperm or the egg, and in the flower, both the sperm on one side and the egg on the other side. Fertilization occurs, all right, and the sperm and egg fertilize with each other, and what do we get? We get that diploid zygote that comes out, which again is what we refer to as the sporophyte. And the cycle just keeps going over and over and over. Okay? Throughout the course of millions of years, these phases have gone through a change, where the haploid phase, little by little, has decreased in size. The diploid phase, little by little, pretty much almost at the same rate, has increased in size. So you see here in the beginning, for example, the haploid phase in the green algae, indicated as yellow, is what? The entire phase of the plant. During this part, there was no no diploid phase. And little by little it established the diploid phase. And guess what? Here the haploid phase and the diploid phase end up being more or less about the same phase of the plant, equally in other words. And then eventually the haploid phase starts to just become a smaller portion of the plant. And this life cycle of the plant ends up utilizing more time. I'm pointing here to the actual branch part here, stem and leaf part. And then eventually in our gymnosperms, we get to the point where this phase of the plant ends up occupying the majority of the life cycle of the plant, and the haploid phase, just the seeded portion, ends up being just very little. All right, and basically that's it. Make sure, oh, I lost my recorder. Make sure that you go over this again at your leisure. Make sure that you review both PowerPoints. Both PowerPoints are going to be together on the one test. So there's going to be one test. No, the test is next week. The week we come back after the holiday. So both PowerPoints will encompass on that test.